sucky, terrible midges. But these are, in this case, pretty good midges. You can actually take a midge, cut its head off, and identify it to species, to certain levels of biology, taxa, right?
Yes.
And you can, these are the heads of midges. And you can use them as indicators of the canary in the coal mine, the bottom of the lake. And this is what I wanted to share with my colleague who's from Mongolia at Lake Hosegal. We did some sampling between Lake Tahoe today versus Lake Hosegal, another beautiful deep lake in Mongolia that we've studied. Tahoe in the 1960s, before all the clarity changed. And Crater Lake, which is in Oregon, is a beautifully clear lake. Very magical, like national park. Tahoe has moved from 20 midges to now 37. The bottom of the lake is becoming more pandemic or cosmopolitan-like. A lot more taxa. Not as pristine as Lake Hosegal in Mongolia, not as pristine as Crater Lake or the old days. So big changes in Little Tahoe are happening. Are you following?
Yeah.
Lesson learned, open water changes in the phytoplankton can lead to big changes in the bottom. Big changes in the bottom affect species that are endemic, only found at the lake. Species that are endemic that are changing, maybe the canary in the coal mine. Literally, it may mean worse things to come for Lake Tahoe if we don't manage the watershed, as we'll talk about. Let's talk about some other things. You learned about this yesterday also. This is a more visual form of seeing all of the introductions of taxa. Yesterday, Jesse told you about introductions of fish and invertebrates. So most of the fish were introduced from the 1800s till about 1915, legally. 1936, we had the invasion and introduction of a crayfish. I'll talk about it. It's about the size of your hand. It's invertebrate. We had salmon introduced in 44, and then remember those shrimp? We had the shrimp introduced, so I'll talk about that again to remind you. And all of the new invasions are illegal. These are all not sanctioned from the government. These were all sanctioned from the government. But by the time the policies in the 60s started, we tried to prevent new invasions, and then we started getting new ones, mostly because of stupid people who think they know what they're doing, in my opinion. And they don't. Then they die, and then they regret it, write in their journals. All right, 1872. Lake Tahoe originally had a simple food web of fish, very simple, only eight species and subspecies. Its top predator was this fish called the Lahontan cutthroat trout. I love this Lahontan cutthroat trout because it is actually North America's largest fish. It gets to about 1 meter large. Not as big as the taimen, but in Mongolia, but 1 meter. So we took some chemistry measurements from the museums that we had samples from, and we were able to recreate the food web of Lake Tahoe in 1870. And you can see the cutthroat trout, the big fish, 1 meter, was indeed the top predator, the lion of the water. And it mostly ate fish in the open water and ate fish in the side of the lake. So it was a good predator. But here we go, 1870s. Humans are so great, we put fish in the lake because we think we're great people. We introduced the Mackinaw, lake trout from the Great Lakes of Michigan and Superior, from the east coast of the United States and Canada. This fish can get to about 1/2 meter long to 3/4 of a meter, but its eyes are a much better predator. And so this fish was introduced. These are our students from Russia who were studying with us, looking at Mackinaw diets, lake trout or Mackinaw. And these fish are pretty good. They're good size, but they're also extremely good predators. So they eat anything that's half their length. And this is a cutthroat trout, the native fish in the mouth of the non-native one. And what ends up happening is, after they eat half of their prey, or anything that's half their size, we ended up reducing the cutthroat trout to extinction. It's no longer found in the lake, the native fish. Instead, by 1959, we have a lake trout non-native dominated system. You learned about that yesterday. Look at the orientation of the food web. What is it doing now? Is it eating mostly in the center?
Everywhere.
It's eating everywhere. It's a good one. It's a big predator. It eats on the bottom chubs, eats on the open water chubs, and loves to eat these crayfish stuff, which So very cosmopolitan. In the 1930s, up until the 19-teens to 1930s, we had the introduction of crayfish. Crayfish are about the size of my hand. One that is about the size of my hand is about 10 years old. It's our only species. Historically, it was native to Oregon and Northern California, but they moved it around for fish feeding and also for human protein. But people in the west of the United States don't like eating crayfish. So it was not the greatest introduction. It's not cultural to us.
But it was legally introduced.
It was legally introduced, yeah. In the what happened here, the last introduction, it was legally introduced especially. In the 1930s, the U.S. had a Great Depression, economic depression.
Yeah.
And there was, even in the West, there were issues with protein. And so the government didn't think too far ahead, but were like, oh, we'll put crayfish everywhere in the West. But they didn't realize this culturally, people don't eat crayfish here. They'll eat fish, but they're not like the southern U.S. or where I'm from in Oklahoma, where we eat crayfish. So the crayfish have doubled their number since 1960s. They basically are the size of my hand. They migrate daily or seasonally to the bottom of the lake to 100 meters, 200 meters. Then in the summertime, they come to 5 or 10 meters. And they're doing this migration, but they're eating every time. So I call them like little cows in the landscape. Eating, moving back up and eating, like we do in the valleys, you know, when we move our animals.
Why in 1991 the crayfish reduced?
Well, this is interesting. So we don't know for sure why. So we always focus on the statistical line. But we think this was an 8-year drought period. So the drought drops the water level and reduces the habitat. Yeah, that's a good eyes. So why do we care about this crayfish? Well, crayfish eat my little invertebrates that also eat algae. So they might actually cause the algae to grow in the nearshore if they control invertebrates. Here's some zooplankton. You saw these guys yesterday at the UC Davis lab. These are the ones that live in the open water. They call this one Ephraim and Dioptimus is what they told you they were eating. These are the natives. Then we used to have Daphnia, the water flea, another cool organism. And these are the shrimp. Look at their eyes. Right? Nice big eyes. Let's see if it does it. Oh, yeah. I have a video of them. So those are the shrimp that are actually moving. You see them? Yeah. Look at these guys. They're about the size of those stoneflies, about a coin size. But look at their eyes. Wow. Seriously, googly. And what did she tell us yesterday that the eyes do for predation?
Wide coverage of the
wide area. They're definitely good predators. Yeah. And they can basically eat these things very quickly. The native zooplankton. They are beautiful, though, I'll have to admit. And so here's the data that shows you kind of what's happening. Here's the data that we didn't show you yesterday. Here's the 1960s till today. Here are the native copepods, one taxa. You still see them in the record. They're just bouncing over time. Here are the native filter feeding zooplankton that eat algae. They used to be very high, and then you introduce shrimp. Shrimp were high, the native zooplankton dropped mostly. So you can see that just one introduction completely screws up the internal mechanics of the water. And these are the guys that clear the water for algae. So now this is another reason we have algal growth in the lake, could be. These shrimp were introduced to try to make this fish bigger. It was another introduced fish. And when you introduce the shrimp, it turns out, another complex story, but it turns out the shrimp ate lots of these guys. And those guys are the favorite food of this fish. So instead of making bigger and fatter fish, it made smaller fish, less fish over time, and the males and females dropped in their size. So it had the opposite effect. They didn't do any science around this. They basically measured things, and the federal government put things in, but there wasn't any discussion of the bad parts of what could happen, and this is indeed. And in fact, the person who introduced this shrimp is a good friend of mine. He passed away last year. His name was Almo Cordoni, one of my mentors. And he's very religious. He's very Catholic. And he felt so, guilty. And for his whole life, since the 70s, can you imagine through your middle ages, all the way to your senior ages, feeling guilty about one moment in time? Because he forever changed the ecosystem of Lake Tahoe. And he's so deeply religious, he always would feel that's this burden he has. Oh, it's terrible. Good guy. He's a good person, though. I'm going to skip these. Let's end with these introductions. You learned about these things yesterday a little bit. These are all illegal introductions, introduced from fishermen, maybe from boats. They attach to boats, and they come into the lake. I'm going to talk about a few of them. One of these is a big deal, and I'll talk about it more in the Tahoe Keys when we visit this location. These are invasive plants. Right now we're worried. We have 2 invasive plants in the lake, curly-leaf pondweed and water milfoil. 2 species, water milfoil and curly-leaf pondweed. In the 80s, we used to see them in the southern part of the lake, mostly in the Tahoe Keys, the wetland that was developed. And over time, we've seen them expand around the lake, mostly to the marinas, mostly to the shallow, warm areas. The habitat has to be right. This new one with the red, I'm very worried about, because it does not live in the shallow area. It also loves living in the deeper water with waves. So it's very aggressive invader. Why do I care about plants? They're supposed to be good for the environment, I guess.
Not always. They are not always good for the environment.
Yeah.
It's produce oxygen and provide with habitats for other species.
Yep, and that's indeed what happened. Not always great for the environment. Habitats are modified. Here's what we can see in some parts of the edge of the lake now. Like we send our divers down or swimmers and they get clogged in plants. Boat propellers get stuck. This is not good for recreation, right? This is that beautiful plant though. It is the curly-leaf pondweed. And then warm water fish that you learned about yesterday. All of these taxa
We'll find a good place.
love these plants. That's their habitat. The other thing that loves these things is goldfish. I know some of you like these for your aquarium, maybe your children may like it. Well, we have the world's record goldfish.
Oh.
Somebody introduced goldfish to the lake, which is, not the greatest thing to do. And it grew, and this is the type of record goldfish that we see. Up until 2 years ago, Australia found an even bigger goldfish in their system. But those bass and bluegill, the ones that you saw videos of yesterday, and in the tanks, they love this habitat of plants. They love the smorgasbord and buffet of crayfish.
Yeah.
That's their preferred food. And now we have shifting climate here. The near shore edge of the water is warming up just enough to allow these warm water fish to reproduce, just 0.5 degree to 1 degree. So a little bit of combination of factors. Fish poop nitrogen and phosphorus. They actually put nitrogen and phosphorus in this perfect ratio, which causes algae to grow in the edge of the lake. They also eat all the native fish. They're very good predators. That's why I put their eyes red here in my cartoon. They like to eat. Let's talk a little bit about climate warming. When you're trying to conserve a lake, it's very difficult to do with all the global changes. So you have to work at the local level. We can't control warming here. But what Julie mentioned to you, you may have heard it, they are trying to work regionally on carbon marketing or on control of pollution, for example, that might contribute to carbon increases. But this is Tahoe's water in the 1900s till 2000s, and then we did some modeling. You're going to warm here by 3 degrees Celsius easily. This is probably more like 4 or 5 degrees now since the paper was written. I mean, that's crazy, guys. You guys are seeing it in your countries, I bet. It is the biggest thing we have to tackle as a community, along with the pandemic. But this will allow us to allow the fish to warm. Asian clams are those tasty clams I told you about yesterday. They're about the size of a coin. They can be quite good. We now have an invasion of clams that has occurred since 2003. Each clam can reproduce, it can self-fertilize. So it has a 4-year lifespan up to the size of a quarter, like the stonefly. And then it can fertilize and reproduce multiple times and then push new ones into the population. So this for us, and they move with the currents. So they're establishing all around the lake. These are things we have to live with. These aren't changes we can make. We can't fix this problem. But why worry about the clams? Here's that beautiful blue water I showed you earlier. What makes the water blue? Literally 100 meters away from this is a clam population, and they excrete nutrients at the nitrogen-phosphorus ratio, allowing algae to grow. That affects recreation. You can clearly see algal growth.
I think that this effect of eutrophication
Is the effect of clams, not sewage, not pollution, clams pooping, literally peeing and pooping, changing and adding nutrients at this ratio that causes this algae to grow. So this is where biology can actually contribute to your eutrophication. Not just point source, not sewage necessarily or things. So this is our story here, very dangerous story of biological manipulation that causes eutrophication.
And also, they reproduce so fast, the clams.
They reproduce fast. So they can grow, and then when they go in their life stage, this small life stage here, they get into the currents of the water, and they move around like the ocean.
So also their death contributes to decomposition, more
Yeah.
nutrients.
Yeah, exactly. So why do we care about the clams? Well, we did a little climate study, and we showed that as the degrees are warming in the summers or getting longer, clams are actually reproducing and producing higher densities of populations. So this clam, the size of just this big, has big ramifications at the population level. These are things we can't control. So what is the food web like today? Let's come back to the food web. I love food webs because I like eating.
food lab today is complex.